how you sort of got into academia. Like, where did you go to university, and what sort of things did you study, and sort of your journey up to today, really?
So I started as an undergraduate student at the University of Leeds, and I did a degree in physiology, which is how the human body works. And in the degree, I just was so fascinated by learning about how everything kind of comes together to mean that we function normally. And there was an opportunity to actually do a summer vacation studentship at the end of my second year, and we still had those opportunities at the University of Sheffield now. So I did a summer vacation studentship, loved the research, and then I was lucky in my third year to be awarded a scholarship to do a PhD. So I actually did a PhD in Leeds in the same lab I did my summer project. But as I was doing my PhD, there were opportunities to get involved in teaching. So I had a tutorial group because I knew the degree programme, I'd just been through it. And then I started doing some lectures, and then I started setting exams. So by the time I'd got my PhD, and then I'd done a couple of years postdoc, I had a lot of research experience, but I also had an awful lot of teaching experience. And I really liked both. And so I kind of made the decision that academia was for me. I really wanted that mix of research and teaching opportunities. And then I was quite lucky to be appointed at the University of Sheffield in 1996, so a long time ago, as a junior lecturer. And for the first part of my career at Sheffield, I was on that traditional research and teaching contract. I brought grants in, I did teaching. But as time progressed, I realised that I shifted more in my passion really being the teaching, and about being innovative in teaching, and about what I could do to really support my students. And then eventually, so I transitioned onto a teaching focused contract a few years ago. I was then from a senior lecturer, I became a senior university teacher. And then I was promoted to Professor of Digital Innovation and Learning and Teaching in 2021. And now my focus is teaching, but actually still research, but it's called scholarship. So it's research into what we call pedagogy, or the actual teaching and the learning experience of students.
I think that is really exciting, and when you talk back to when you first did teaching, and when you're back in your you're doing a PhD and then you were teaching sort of undergrad students, how was that when you very first started? When you think to, obviously now you've had a lot of years experience teaching and doing lecture. Do you remember what it was like when you first started? Because for me, for example, I've worked a couple of months in a nursery before with little kids, and at the moment I volunteer each week at a school helping in a DT class, building a race car. And I find it quite difficult to teach the kids. Obviously they're a lot younger than university students, so it's harder to keep them engaged and stuff like that. But do you find it difficult? Well, did you find it difficult back then when you very first started? What were the challenges you faced getting into teaching at the beginning?
So when I got into teaching at the beginning, it was I did a lot of prep work, an awful lot of prep work, because I felt it was a little bit of imposter syndrome, particularly because my very first tutorial group was the first year of my PhD. So, I was only 2 or 3 years older than the students that I was acting as a personal or an academic tutor for. So it was just, for me, it was about making sure I did thorough preparation so that I went into whatever the teaching session was as prepared as I could be. And then I think I was always open with the students about, your academic staff, myself included, we don't know everything. So there might be questions you ask me I don't know the answers to straight away, but I will go away and find those answers out. So I think being open and honest from the word go, that I'm a human, I'm like you, I don't know everything, but I know an awful lot more than you do. So hopefully I'll be able to help you. I was actually quite lucky as well, because the way I do my teaching and the way I engage with my students is very much to work as a partnership. So it's, if a student asks me a question, I don't give them the answer, and that might sound a bit strange, but I don't give them the answer directly, but what I will do is have a conversation and pose some questions to structure them to get to the answer. And that was just something that came naturally to me. And it's there's a lot of kind of pedagogical literature out there about this is a really great way to get students to kind of engage and kind of take ownership of their learning. And I was quite lucky because that was just the natural way for me. And I've never actually had any formal training at all in how to teach, how to lecture, all of that stuff I've kind of learned on, as I've been doing it. And so I would say I didn't feel hugely confident at first, but I just went in really prepared, and your confidence grows. I've been at Sheffield 28 and a half years, so I've done lots and lots of teaching, and I still get a bit nervous going into a lecture just in case something goes catastrophically wrong. But obviously I've got a lot of experience now, so even if things do go wrong, there's a technical failure, I've got, there's something in the back of my mind that I can do that's a backup that will save the day, if you like.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you mentioned before that like when you wouldn't give the answer directly and you would sort of like pose them questions to or sort of like structure or lead them to the answer. That made me think about how in the brain, when you make like you have connections, right? So my background is not biology; I'm an engineer. Yeah, so I think maybe my understanding is not perfect. So correct me if I'm wrong. But my understanding is that let's say you want to learn something, and to do that, neurons have to like form connections between different places to learn something. So is it like the more connections you have to a specific place, the better you'd understand it? Like, because rather than just having initial point and then answer, you've almost like had to build like 5 points along the way to get to the answer, so the knowledge is more concise. Does that kind of make sense?
It does. I mean, I think I would say it's the difference between passively absorbing information, which is, it's really hard to remember things if you're just sat and you're passive and you're listening, versus active participation. So a lot of the teaching I do traditional lectures. We have active learning sessions, and it's very much around getting the students to kind of problem solve, take what they know and understand and apply it to different problems. Because and they do those in groups, so they're discussing things, so they're kind of making those connections between what we've taught, what we've looked at, and then how they can apply it, and that's their assessment as well, actually. So it kind of helps them with their assessment. But it's that active participation that's really, really important for student learning, actually. And that's why, didactic lectures, there's a lot of discussion out in the sector about whether a lecture is the right way to teach, because, I've been to seminars where, 20 minutes in, your concentration starts to flag, and we're running 50-minute lectures and we're expecting students to focus for the full 50 minutes. They're not going to focus for the full 50 minutes, and we can't even do it in a 50-minute seminar. So there's this big argument about, are didactic lectures the right way to deliver content and teach? I mean, personally, I think they have their place and I think they are important, but I think mixing them with active learning, interactive activities, either in the same session or in different sessions, is really valuable, and it really helps students kind of learn. They can see what they know, what they don't know, what they need to focus on in their self-study, what they still need to revise, and it helps them develop that skill set around applying what they know to solve novel problems, because that's what my graduates to do. When they go, whatever they end up doing, I want them to go, I'm using my knowledge in biomedical science in my job, and I'm going to use that to solve this problem. And we didn't cover this problem in the degree programme, but I know I've got the knowledge and the skills to solve it. So that's what I want them to get.
And like, for me, when I think about all the different lecturers I've had for our university, each has been so different. Like, I would say there's none that teach the same way or talk the same way or anything. They all have their completely unique style. And if I'm being completely frank, some were amazing and some were absolutely terrible. Like, why are they so different? Is there some sort of standardized, like, so you lead the faculty of bioscience, is that right? Like the faculty director?
I was the faculty director for education for a couple of years. I finished in that role last August, so I've been having a year where I'm doing more leadership work in the School of Biosciences now.
So how does it work? Does leadership give a structured way to teach a course, and then the professors kind of have some wiggle room to follow it, or do professors have their own ideas of how they're going to teach that course, and like what sort of structure is there to do it?
I think there's all sorts of different ways, actually, and it's probably right that there's different ways to approach this. So if you go back, to the comment you made about everyone's different, yes, everyone is different, and actually I'd be really surprised if that wasn't the case. Because we're all different, we've all got different experiences, training, lived experiences, we've got different ways that we feel comfortable to teach. I feel really comfortable being really open and honest with my students, so I'll share snippets from my own life. I have 3 cats, so we often have a little conversation about the cats, but what I'm trying to do there is show my students that they can talk to me. I'm a person, and I feel really comfortable doing that. But I know that there are other academic staff who kind of feel quite anxious about being kind of really open with students for all sorts of different reasons, and so they might feel, they might teach in a way that's a little bit more formal. And some students will like that, some students won't like that. The student body is diverse as well. So, for example, what you found great and what you found not so great, some other student might be the other way around. And it's just all down to our likes. I think in terms of teaching and being a kind of someone who teaches in the university, I would say, when I started, there was no formal training. And I said earlier on, I have no formal kind of qualifications per se. I'm a principal fellow of the Advanced HE. So that's a kind of a recognition. But when I was starting, there was no formal training. I would say in the last 10 to 15 years, the formal training has become, it's much more common. It's there. There's lots of opportunities for more junior academic staff to kind of get that training. And I think teaching is really opened up. When I first started, we had lectures and we've got practicals and we've got tutorials, but it was all didactic lecturing. But what's happened over time is that we recognise the value of other activities. And so I've kind of brought those in. I suppose I'm always someone that's thinking, well, that went really well. I got great feedback on my module, but what can I do differently next year that will help my students even more? And so I'm continually, reviewing what I'm doing. I'm continually trying different things. A great example from my perspective is lecture capture. So I started using lecture capture at Sheffield in 2015. So I've been using it for 10 years, and there were very few staff using it. And I was a little bit skeptical about lecture capture. I was, I'll put my hands up and say they'll not come to my class if I capture my lecture. And then I had, I was in a meeting. I'd been mentored by the equivalent of Mary Vincent, what's now the Vice President for Education. And I was in a meeting and they were saying lecture capture's coming. And I was like, oh no, lecture capture, no. But then I thought, well, it's coming, I can't change it, let's have a go. And I actually had to go with it in one of my modules, and I had evaluated the students afterwards, and oh my goodness, a 180-degree turn from me. I just realised how supportive a technology it was for my students. So that was it. From that point, I was using lecture capture. So I've been using lecture capture in all my modules since 2015. And then I ended up leading the university's implementation group. So we've got lots of lecture capture recordings at the University of Sheffield. And 99% of lectures are recorded at the University of Sheffield, which is insane.
That's
it's a
really
really
good.
kind of, it's like, I can't remember, I did the numbers, it might be 33, 34, 35,000 recordings we have a year.
Wow.
It's
Wow.
huge. And that's transformative, and it's because there are academic staff who are continually thinking about what can I do, what can I change, how can I enhance the student learning experience, that we end up introducing technologies such as, lecture capture, we change things and we make things better for students. But if I'm honest, some academics embrace that, others are a bit more resistant. So some academics are still sort of teaching in a very traditional way. It's their comfort zone. It's how they learned how to teach. And change is difficult, actually. Change is quite challenging. And some people, like myself, go, yes, change, great, let's do it. Whereas other people are, oh, I don't like change, I'm not going to change. So that's why we end up with kind of such a varied way of doing things. Now, in terms of modules and programmes, as consistent as possible is great, but we have to also recognise that we have to let people work to their strengths in that teaching space. So we need that little bit of flexibility, I think.
Yeah, and I think I completely agree with the lecture captures. Like recording the lectures and being able to watch them online at a different point is the most incredible tool ever, especially for me as well, because, I personally, I struggle to go to every lecture. I like my attendance to lectures isn't perfect compared to a lot of my peers. But with having that lecture capture, is so useful for me because it means that if I do miss one or two lectures, I'm not completely don't know what's going on anymore. Like, I can still follow each week and make sure. And in terms of lectures that have, I wanted to talk about this as well, like different teaching styles in the lectures. But for me, the ones that have had really good lecture captures, I've done so well in. So if I compare two modules, for example, like for my maths module, they didn't. My teacher used the whiteboard, so they didn't ever record what he was writing during the whole lecture, so you could just hear his voice. Which to me, what's even the point of that? Like, I go to watch the lecture, and it's just a blank screen with a voice talking about maths, which is virtually impossible. Like, as maths as it is, that's impossible to follow. So that did nothing for me, and I really struggled in that module because of that simple fact that it wasn't recording or even a screen or anything. I didn't do well in that module compared to I had like an engineering statics module, and this was my favorite module ever, by the way. The professor printed out like 100-page booklet for every single student, and it had all of the engineering statics drawings that you could write on, draw all the problems, and every lecture she would record her drawing and going through. It was like a 2-hour lecture, and she would go through and do all the problems in person, and it was amazing. And I did the best out of that module, out of any of the modules. So I think, definitely the different teaching styles, you do see an effect on performance based on those sorts of tools that you use. Have you found that any of the tools you've tried haven't worked that well over the years of trying different things?
Oh, that's a really good question. So firstly, before I answer that, if I could just come in and talk about that maths module.
Of course.
We call that chalk and talk, and actually the technology doesn't lend itself very well, and it's something that we've been working on at the University of Sheffield for quite some time to get a resolution. We kind of got a solution, but it's not easy to implement in all of the teaching spaces, but it's slowly rolling out. So hopefully, in a few years, we'll get there where all the mathsy stuff's been recorded.
Yeah.
Have I tried something that hasn't worked? If I'm honest, I don't think I've ever tried anything that's not worked, but there's something that used to work better previously that's not working so well now, and it's related to when we went into the pandemic and we were teaching online using Blackboard Collaborate, and all of a sudden we had a chat box, and the students were asking lots of questions in the chat box, and I was using the chat box to kind of gauge the room. I was getting them to put emojis in if they understood, thumbs up or thumbs down, because I had quite big cohorts. And then as we came back into the physical teaching space, I thought, wouldn't it be great if we retained the chat box in the physical teaching space? And so Encore Echo 360 has a question tool that's disabled normally, but you can enable it if you want to use it. So I enabled it and I used it. And that first couple of years back, after the kind of COVID pandemic and the lockdowns, students were using the chat box loads in my teaching class. So I used to have the desktop and my laptop, and one of them was being displayed and the other one wasn't, and the one that wasn't, I'd have the questions popping up and I'm able to see the questions and I'd answer the questions, or I'd say, right, I'll take that one away and I'll pop it on the discussion forum on Blackboard. But what I found this academic year is that now that we're getting distant away from students who'd experienced Blackboard Collaborate in the chat box, they're not really using the question tool anymore. Yeah. So I've still got it there and it's still open, and I still tell them about it and say, if you want to ask a question in class, this is what you do. But I'd say this year I've had maybe 20 questions the whole academic year. And I think I had something like 300 to 400 questions that first year as we came back from that lockdown period. So it's a technology that did work, but it's not a technology that students are finding. This is telling me that students are not finding that useful. So I'm kind of moving away. I mean, I've still got it, and I'll probably still enable it next year. If it's not used next year, I just won't bother, because it's not a technology that students are finding useful. And actually that tells us something around technologies, and that technologies change, but actually students' use of technologies change. The same technology that was great 5 years ago might not be so good now. And that's because students, their experience, the pandemic was a massive thing, a huge impact. And I can really see that chat box was really important when we came back, but it's not so important to students now. Yeah. So now, it's me thinking about, well, what's the next technology? And actually the one I'm thinking about in terms of students is AI, and how we can incorporate AI into some of the teaching or assessments that we're doing in the modules that I'm currently running.
Yeah, and I'm like massive advocate for AI in learning. I mean, I use it every single day, um, mainly to understand like complicated problems. I'd say that with AI, it's pretty bad with maths, or if I try and give it like actual mathsy problems. But with biology or physics, it's really really good because like recently I've been trying to understand biology better. I'm trying to understand physics better, and I'll watch YouTube videos online of sort of going over topics, but a lot of it I wouldn't understand. So then I'll go and ask ChatGPT a question about it and say explain it, and then I'll say I won't understand some bits. So I'll target some bits out and say, oh, can you explain this simpler? And I'll say, oh, I think you mean like I think it means this. Is that right? And it'll say, oh, you're kind of along the right lines, but not. It's like a teacher basically, like a personal teacher, and I use it in that sense, and I
Yeah.
find it very very useful.
I mean, it can be, but you need to be careful,
Yeah,
because it's not always right. I've put things so actually, at the moment all of my modules are open book online assessments. They're not invigilated exams, and that's because those assessments are not tell me what we know. It's apply what we know to problem solve, and the AI is not so good at that. But if I have put some maths things because I've got some maths in some of my modules. If I
yeah,
put math things, so it just doesn't, it can't deal with standard units, and it gets the
yeah,
calculation completely wrong. But you do have to be careful because I have put things through, and it comes back with things that are just wrong.
yeah.
So
I mean, I would say that from my experience, if it's your degree, like obviously if it's biomed, or for me if it's like engineering, if I ask it questions actually for my course, it will struggle to get it right because it's at that university, the high university level. I think it struggles with. But let's say for me, for example, like let's say I'm trying to learn some biology. I'm probably learning at a sixth form level or something. So me asking it questions, I'm presuming it's probably right, and then if it's not, I probably accept that degree of like misinformation because it's an efficient tool to learn. Even if let's say 5% of it is wrong, I feel like the time it saves, maybe it's okay to have that level of misinformation. I suppose it's like as time goes on, the error region will become lower and lower. So it's sort of accepting what tolerances you'd accept with your learning, if that makes sense.
And that's right. And I think there's a very different scenario from kind of doing that approach that you were talking about for your degree studies versus doing it for your own kind of what we would call lifelong learning
Mm.
outside of a formal kind of structured degree program. And there is a big difference there. And I'm really open with my students, in that they really shouldn't be using it for their learning, but there's lots of things they can use it for. So we haven't got this assessment yet, but my year two module in a couple of years' time, there's a bit of a lead-in time with the way you've got to kind of get permission and authorization and approval for changes. But we're bringing in a new coursework assessment, and in a group, we're going to give the students a research paper. And the first thing they're going to do is use Notebook LM to do a summary. And then they're going to evaluate that summary and then do a video presentation evaluating the paper, and kind of evaluating how successful Notebook LM was in terms of the summary that it generated. And so that's going to be teaching them how to use Notebook LM in a way that will actually help them. So I use Notebook LM. I submitted a scholarship paper about a month and a half ago, something like that. And I'd done a Google search and I had 58 papers to read. And I was like, I haven't got time to read 58 papers and find out which are the ones I really need. So actually I put them through Notebook LM and asked Notebook LM to summarise each one. Then I looked at the summaries and then I picked out the ones that I thought were the really key papers. And then I read those ones myself more in depth and made my own notes from them and then put it with the summary. And then I used those notes to then write my introduction and my discussion to my paper. And that saved me loads of time. So, I'm not using AI lots, but I'm using it for things that that will save me time. And I think from that kind of perspective, I think it's really 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 great. It's really helpful. The
Mm.
I was at the education conference last month at the University of Sheffield, and there was a great panel discussion with some students, and they were talking about all the ways that they use AI in kind of administrative tasks that they do in their learning, and it was really clear that some of them were using AI loads, but it was great because they were using AI to help them with the administration of their learning and not actually is a replacement for the actual learning. So, you know, they were using it to kind of organise timetables. One of a student, I think, was using it to plan out their revision timetable. They put all the information in and said, sort me a revision timetable out. What a great way to use AI. So it was brilliant. It's really good.
Yeah, it's so useful. Like, at the moment, I'm planning to make a documentary this summer, and I've made like a whole brainstorm of like all of the different ideas and topics and themes I want to explore, and everything about that. And then to go to, let's say I want to get people involved with the documentary, I decided I'd make a proposal, a formal document that I could show them and say, oh, this is what I want to do. So then I used AI. I put in my whole brainstorm into AI and said, like, oh, can you help me format a whole proposal based on this information? And then it did it, and then I just used that, and it's so useful. Like, it just saves me an incredible amount of time. I can't almost imagine getting by without it. I think, you know, it's interesting you talk about sort of having to summarize those like 50 papers you had to read through, because I'd say that in engineering, reading papers is something that we never do at all, ever. So like maybe, you know, maybe once I go on and do my master's, or if I do a PhD, I'm sure I'll have to read papers. But right now, at undergrad level, I have not read a paper once in 3 years. So, you know, my girlfriend, she is Danish and studies in Denmark. And so I was helping her. She studies religion, and, you know, she was having to read through those papers and talking about how difficult it was. So I was like, oh, let me look through it. And I was like, I realized, you know, I saw how long these papers were, and just to read through it and figure it all out, it just took so much time. And I just couldn't believe sort of how much work other students have to do in terms of reading these papers. So I can see how for courses that have a lot of papers to read, AI and summarizing AI would be very, very useful for those specific courses.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was useful for me, and I'm hoping if we do this with the year one, the year two students, they are students in the biomedical program. It's really when they get to year three, possibly year four as well, and then masters, then they're really reading lots and lots of original research papers and longer review articles rather than what's in the textbook. So if I train my students up in my module in year two, when they go into third year and they have all these papers to read, I'm hoping that they'll go, oh, I can just put these papers through Notebook LM. I mean, I think, you know, when I did it, it wasn't perfect. You know, in the summaries of some of the really key papers, it had missed some things out. So I think it is important to then go back and look at what's in there and just make sure everything important that is pulled out is actually has been pulled out. But I think as a tool to help you kind of summarize some research papers so that you can then kind of digest them and see which are the really key ones. You know, it's really interesting. If you do we use PubMed, which is our database. If you do a search on PubMed, you can come up with thousands and thousands of papers. And, you know, our students, you know, they write introductions to their laboratory reports. They write, you know, extended essays and things. So we're expecting them to go away and find papers. And it can be quite daunting if you do do a search and you get like, there are 33,000 papers on this topic. And then you've got to pick them out. You know, using the kind of AI to do that could be really helpful. I mean, it's completely different to when I was an undergraduate student. So I only got access to a computer in the third year of my undergraduate program. That's
Wow.
how long ago it was. And, you know, when we had to write an essay and we had to go and find papers, we had something called Medline, which was this massive long list, you know, big row of books. And you know, if I was interested in potassium channels, I'd go and look up potassium channels in the book. I'd write down what they'd been published, then I had to go and find it in the library, then I had to go and photocopy it. And what that meant was that there was limited papers, so we had a very small number of papers that we could read really in depth. But the challenge that current students have, there's almost too much information there. So anything that helps them digest and identify the key information, you know, that can only be helpful, and AI can certainly do that.
Yeah, because I remember that specific. So my girlfriend's only started. I've been at university for like 3 or 4 years now. I've changed degrees a few times, but she's only just started in the last year, and she had a project, a course where she had to. There was a theme or an idea, and she had to go and find five papers on that topic and do it. And the same thing happened. You know, I'd never really explored this before, but I've heard of Google Scholars. So I was like, oh, we'll go on there. We'll search for a paper. And, you know, we typed in the keywords, and, you know, thousands of papers came up, and I was like, you know, I was a bit stuck, and I just said, you know, at this point, we'll just choose ones that we think are relevant, because otherwise we'll be here forever.
Yeah.
There's not really any other way to approach it. I was just thinking about how earlier you were talking about with your students, you're quite personal when you would talk to them, be open with them. And you mentioned that other professors weren't as comfortable doing that. It made me think about Danish universities, because this is one of the key things that they really talk about in Danish universities, because I'm going to go do my master's there, is this sort of, if you imagine a hierarchy structure, and let's say in the UK it's quite large, so, undergrad students would never really maybe have contact with higher up professors or leadership. But in Denmark, they keep this hierarchy structure really, really, low down, if that makes sense. So students are very close with their professors, and they try and keep the classes a lot smaller, and people have very close relationships with the staff. So, and they see a lot of benefits to that. So I think it is difficult in the UK universities to do something like that, though, because I will say, like, courses are very large. I have like 300 people on my course, so it would be something that would be quite difficult to do. How do you think that you, in your course, in your lectures, sort of keep, even if you have a large cohort, sort of keeps those, maybe everyone engaged and working together? How do you manage that?
So you're right, there is a real challenge in that, so the largest module I teach on is 360 students, and my smallest module this year is 97 students, which is still quite a large group.
Yeah.
And there's no way I can know names, just no way I can learn all of those names. And I'm not great with learning names to faces anyway at the best of times. So I think for me, there's a number of things that I do. So the first thing is the active learning. So active learning so I use the polling questions in the Echo 360 platform. So when I do my lectures or I do my active learning, I've got all my slides in the lecture capture platform. And so I use the polling there. It's anonymous, and so it's low risk. So I encourage the students to put their answers in, but I give them a bit of time. So you'll find me in an active learning session going around the lecture theatre, kind of scrambling over benches, talking to students in groups, brainstorming with them, helping them work out how to approach the problem, how to solve it, what the answer might be. Again, going back to what I said, not telling them the answer, but getting them to get to do with the answer. So there's about, for me, it's about, I do have that interaction with smaller groups. It's in the active learning sessions. I think it's about really supporting my students. So, I like to think I go above and beyond in terms of the resources that I make available, in terms of the content, the skills development. And then it's also about having some personalised things on my virtual learning environment, my Blackboard pages. So I've got a Spotify playlist for my Year 2 and my Year 3 modules, and that came out of COVID. That I got them to fill a Google form in with songs that had a biology related title. So DNA by Little Mix or Heart of Glass, Blondie. And I was really pleased I asked them to put their level, because I ended up with so many songs that I've got 3 Spotify playlists. Year 1, Year 2 and Year 3. I only actually use the Year 2 and the Year 3 because they're the only modules I run. And so I've got the Spotify playlist on the Blackboard page, and it's publicly available playlist. And after graduation, they can bookmark it, and after graduation, if they want to kind of reminisce, they can go back and play the Spotify playlist. We don't play it in class or anything, and they can still add songs to it, which they still do. But it's those little personal touch. And then other things like I found a really great podcast last summer around some of the kind of ethical and moral considerations in medical research and medical science, and some really quite challenging topics were in those podcasts, but actually I thought they were so fantastic I wanted to share them with my students, so I put a link in, with a little trigger warning. There's some challenging concepts in here, but it's really, and I don't know how many of them have used it, but again, it's just, I'm sharing me as a person, even in those large cohorts. If a student emails me, I'll make sure I get back to that student within 48 hours, which is kind of the norm that we aim for. I always try and kind of support my students as much as possible. So I think in the larger groups, it is about them seeing me as a person and feeling that if they've got a problem, they can actually just drop me an email. I always say to them, if you have a question, ask me. There is no such thing as a silly question. If you don't know the answer, it's not a silly question. And so they ask me all sorts of stuff. I mean, sometimes they ask me stuff and I go, it's in the handbook. I've not read the handbook. But I'll go, why don't we look at the handbook in section such and such? It says. And but yeah, so I think it's about supporting. So for me, it's about, in my module, the thing that goes right in the center is, how do I support my students? The content sits around that. The way I teach sits around that. The support I provide in terms of the technologies and additional skills development all sits around support my students. Because if you get your support for your students right, they love it, they feel supported, they feel confident, they feel happy. And that's what we want from our students. We want them to feel happy in the learning environment that you've got.
100%. Because I think, when I was preparing for this podcast, I was thinking about, what makes me feel happy with, when I have all the tools available. Like, when do I feel the best about a module? And I think it's usually with how many resources they have available. So if they're the modules that don't have any resources, they might just have the presentation that they've gone through the whole year and that's sort of it. Then I really struggle with that. And because it's, there's not much available. And then if you have more questions, there's no other sources to go to. But then I have some modules who they'll have the complete notes of the whole module on maybe one really infinitely long PDF, which is, it's good because then it's very thorough if you want to go to it. And then they also have the PowerPoints throughout the module. So then that's more like the compressed, like summarized version. And then they also have the lecture captures and other sort of things. And I think when you have all of those together, and they'll have videos of going through maths problems or like tutorial sheets. Those are amazing as well, because then you get to see step by step how they've actually solved the problem. Because sometimes the biggest, honestly, one of the things I spend the longest on is when you have a PowerPoint and they've gone through a maths problem, but they skipped a few steps. And you will literally, I will spend like an hour trying to figure out how they've gone from this step to that step, because they haven't said how they've done it, and they've just kind of assumed that everyone would know that, and I'm just there like, I can't work it out. So I really appreciate when there's like a thorough step-by-step process of going through it. I really enjoy it. I think in terms of lectures that I've had that have been really good, I think I think the ones that have struggled were the ones that they don't show relevant information. So I like in my lectures where, I'm doing engineering, so I'm fascinated by the world of engineering. Like, the professors that have been great have said, we're learning about control theory. Here's like a SpaceX rocket, and this is how they've used it in real life. I love the real life applications, because it's like, that's why I'm here doing this course, so that when I finish, I can actually go and do a career in this industry. So it's nice learning about, okay, you're learning this, and it might seem really abstract, but this is actually its application. So I think that's another place where professors do well, is if they show the real world application. So, you mentioned before how you might put some links to something that you were interested in or something like that. And yet that's being personal to the student. I also think it's good to show sort of, well, this is also what the industry are talking about. This is the discussions they're having, because then students are sort of engaged in that world as well. Do you think you can tell with students, like, if they're going to go into academia, or if they'll like leave and go into a career? Is there a different type of student that is perhaps more interested in like going to PhD research, or if they're going into sort of industry? Is that different paths almost?
That's an interesting question. I think for my students, I don't think there's necessarily a difference. I think, for my students, I encourage them to engage with the learning, to engage with the content so they understand it, and then develop that application problem solving. I do make direct links out where possible in terms of how they can use the skills and the knowledge in the future. And a lot of what I teach is relevant whether they're going into academia or they're going into the pharmaceutical industry, or they're going out, into the healthcare sector. There's content and skills that they'll use no matter where they go. I think, there are certainly students in my modules who know that what they want to do is a PhD and then potentially stay in academia. And I very much have got students who go, actually, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to go and I'm going to train to be a teacher, or I'm going to do and be a physician's associate, or I'm going to work as a clinical audiologist. I'm going to do this training program. So they're going off into all sorts of different and diverse careers. But I think a lot of what they get in the modules in the biomedical program, it doesn't matter actually what career they're going off into. A lot of it's around skills. I'll take you all the way back to when I was a student a long time ago. My degree program was focused on content. And that's because we didn't have the World Wide Web, and we didn't have emails and anything like that. And if you needed to know something, you had to go to the library, or you looked in your lecture notes. And so that was, we got things from the lectures, and then we went to the library. And nowadays, I would say the content is important in understanding it, but it's the key content, it's the concepts and the ideas. Because actually, we've all got mobile phones and kind of mobile devices. I mean, if we want to know something, we can look it up. And what we need is our students graduating who've got the core concepts and ideas and understanding, but actually the skills to apply that to problem solve and to evaluate information they're given in other sources, like AI, for example. For me, that's where the degree programs sit now. There is some knowledge, some stuff they need to know, but actually it's much more about their skills and the skills that they're going to take out after graduation, whether that's a PhD or they're going into the business sector or education or healthcare and things like that. So I think modules that embed that skills development and recognise those links to employability, students value, because they can see the value to themselves, like you mentioned in engineering. They can see that value as they go out after graduation.
100%, because I think, with engineering, I think one of the key focuses is problem solving. They'll give you loads of different scenarios and you've just got to solve them, and that's sort of emphasised the whole way through the course. And I very much feel like any time I've thrown into a situation now, at the moment I'm on a placement year, and it's been rotational, so I've done 4 months in different departments, and every time I'm thrown into a different department, I do feel like I can just pick it up, because I have the skills to be, or even though it's all completely new each time, I know where to look, I know how to research, and then it's almost like I have those foundational knowledge to learn quickly about the new tasks. So it is really fun. I think I wanted to talk about mental health in education, because I think that university is a place that a lot of people find a lot of high pressure, and they find it quite stressful at times. A common sight I saw in the Diamond, one of the university buildings, was exam season, and there was this table with the students there, and they had like 30 Monster energy drinks on their table, and I was like, how long have they been there at this table? I think it's common for a lot of people to do all-nighters and stuff like that. Personally, I've always felt all-nighters is a terrible idea, because it just ruins the whole structure and routine of every day, and you're not going to learn much. But you do see a lot of students having this mindset of, it's exam season, I have to do all-nighters and cram and things like that. Do you think, why are students doing this? Is it because they're really stressed out and it causes them to do things that are extreme, or what is this sort of, or is it the culture? Is it a university culture of doing things like that? Where do you think it comes from?
Oh, that's a really good question. So first I would say that the student kind of body is really diverse. So while you're seeing some students doing those all-nighters and the monster drinks, there are lots of other students who are not doing that.
Yeah.
So I, funny enough, the paper I submitted kind of a month or so ago was a paper looking at engagement with lecture capture and academic attainment. And what I could see is that the students that binge watch just before the exams are the ones that fail. So what I would say is there's a cohort of students that think they can just catch up just before the exams, and then they just blitz it, but they're binge watching. And we know if you binge watch a Netflix series, you forget what was on in each episode, and that's what happens. So I think for some students, it's probably that they have left things too late. There's that realization, oops, I should have started this revision much earlier. I think for some students, I think there might be some peer pressure there. My friends are doing it, so maybe I should do it. I think for some students, so exam time is an incredibly stressful time for students. And as a university, one of the things that we do is we try to take what's called a program level approach to teaching, but importantly to assessments, spreading out assessment deadlines, not having too many assessments. And, in biosciences at the moment, for all our programs, we're just undergoing a massive big curriculum review. And that curriculum review is going to lead to a rebalancing in terms of the number of assessments, but also we're going to have, in the long term, we'll end up with no 10 credit modules, And this is a model that university's moving to, but I actually think it's a really good thing, because we're going to have, if you've got two 10-credit modules with 2 exam each and a piece of coursework each, that's 4 assessments. But if you now have a 20-credit module, you've got 1 exam and a piece of coursework. So you're reducing the overall number, and we've got to get that balance right between the number of exams and the number of pieces of coursework, and what those pieces of coursework are, and what the structure of the exams is, and how it all maps out. So what we have to think about the student journey through their learning and the student journey through their assessments, and we need to put ourselves in the position of a student and think, what would I feel if I had this? What would I feel if I had 4 deadlines in 1 week? I wouldn't be feeling very happy, and it's not surprising. So I think we've made really great progress at the university. Program level approach actually started kind of 2018 time, and we have made lots of progress, but I think there's more progress to come. There's a university with there's a big curriculum kind of evaluation going on, and I think we're absolutely moving in the right direction. We know students have got specific learning differences that mean that they do struggle with certain aspects, and that's why we, at the university, where we've got this, I can't remember what it's called now, is it inclusive learning strategy or something? So the idea here is that so a student has a specific learning difference, they have a learning support plan which highlights the things that would support the student, and then we try and implement as many of those as where practicable. It's not always possible. But the kind of inclusive learning design approach it kind of says, well, most of the students with a specific learning difference and a learning support plan all need the same thing. So why don't we just give that to all the students and embed it into the kind of standard structure of that module, which is what I tried to do with the way I kind of design and structure my modules, so that actually it's only the very small number of students where we've got to make a small number of accommodations, and that way we are supporting all of our students as much as we possibly can, and then it's much easier to do the kind of more specialist little bits of support that we need to put in for the smaller number of students. And actually, there are some students at university who don't have a learning support plan, and they need one, and they don't realise. So I've had students over the years that they've said something to me and I've gone, have you ever been evaluated for dyslexia? And they go, oh, no, but I've always struggled with X, Y, Z. And I go, why don't you head over and we'll get you assessed, go down to the kind of dyslexia and disability service. And actually they've gone for an assessment and they've been diagnosed with a specific learning difference. And some of these are students in year 3 who are first class students, but they just make some throwaway comment about, I can't write essays and I've got to write lots of essays this year. And then I've been able to get that support. But there are definitely students studying who don't have a learning support plan, who should have a learning support plan. So if we design our teaching to kind of be as supportive as possible, then we're helping those students. And if they feel supported, they feel less anxious. If they feel less anxious, they're more settled in their studies, they're less likely to do those kind of help right at the end things. So I think, I think there's a number of reasons why students do that binge watching at the end. But I think there's lots that at Sheffield that we do really well to help. That's not to say there isn't stuff that we can do more of, and maybe different things moving forward. I think there's an opportunity with the curriculum redevelopment work to really kind of put ourselves in that place for what that student journey is.
I think it's really fascinating you told that story about the dyslexia, because a super similar thing has happened to me recently where so at my work I have this mentor who, he's nearly retirement now. He's a really intelligent guy, and he's been sort of helping me throughout the year with a lot of the work, and we'll sit down together each day and go over a lot of like the theory, the engineering theory that I might not understand. He'll help me with that stuff. And he had a presentation and there wasn't any pictures in there, and we were talking about it, and I was saying about how it's just really difficult, this presentation. And then he started asking me loads of questions about how I learn and with like big text and pictures and things like that. And then he made me realize that I'm a very much image or picture oriented person. Like when I can see what's happening, I learn really quickly. So I think that's probably why I'm quite drawn to engineering, is because I can see visibly the things which are going on, and then I can absorb that information, understand how it works. But if there's a whole, when I try and read a paper and there's just text, I have absolutely no idea what's going on, and it takes me so long to sort of sift through the words and understand all the words and understand what it's trying to say in the message. So that's something that I really learned about myself recently, is that to be able to learn things well, I have to sort of visualize it and see it, and I can't really just rely on the words. So I think I mean, linking it back to what you're saying with the teaching the course, I suppose having a course that's designed for sort of having, you know, a lot of show and tell sort of thing, and then also the text, having that balance with the teaching styles is almost like a great way to keep everyone involved and not like isolate them out. Because, you know, going back to that maths module that I struggled with, the only resource that they had in that maths module to learn all the content was a 300-page PDF, and it was all words. And I couldn't believe that a maths module was just being taught with all words. And I was just, you know, it was the opposite of the reason why I got into maths. I got into maths because, you know, you can draw the graphs and the symbols and everything, and it was just describing the mathematical problems, and I absolutely hated it. So yeah, that was definitely something I learned about myself.
Yeah, it's really interesting actually, because I think, you know, going back to something we said earlier on, you know, you probably hated that, but some students would love it. And you know, it's one of the things I try and work with other academics, you know, when I'm talking to them, is to remind them that our student body is diverse. You know, so I have a very small number of flipped recordings in my teaching. So we've got in-class didactic sessions, some flipped recordings for students to work on in their own time, you know, little like content-based videos, and then the active learning sessions. And it's interesting because in module evaluation, I'll always have a proportion of students that say, we want more flipped and less didactic lectures, please. And then a proportion of students will say, we don't want any flipped, we want it all didactic. And then a whole load in the middle that says, yeah, we like all three. And so, you know, it's students like different things. And one of the things I try and do with my students is remind them that their learning experience is not necessarily the same learning experience as the person sat next to them. So, you know, I can't make all of my in-class sessions didactic, but because they want that, because actually there's a whole load of other students go, no, I need the active learning sessions. Or another student says, you know, oh, I need some flipped stuff because, you know, I've got caring commitments, or I commute and sometimes I can't make it, or I've got to work, you know, cost of living crisis, I've got to work, I can't make it. So I like having the flipped because I'm getting the same experience as the other students because they're watching flipped as well. And I think that is quite challenging to get students to recognise that what they see as the best is the best for them, and it's not necessarily the best for another student. And we've got to try and get that balance right of having something for everybody in the module, so all students kind of feel supported in that learning space. And that's a challenge for me, getting the students to recognise that. And then also some staff as well. And, you know, some academic staff they'll often think, well, when I was a student, you know, this is what we did. And, you know, we're not in that space anymore. The environment is completely different. The technologies that we've got to help support our students are completely different to, you know, when I started lecturing, it was an overhead projector. It wasn't even PowerPoint. You know, it was little acetates that I used to draw on in advance with permanent marker pens and then put on the screen and then project and then talk around. So, but it, you know, it goes back again, you know, it's quite hard for me at my age. It is a little bit hard to put myself in the shoes of my students because, you know, I'm a lot older. I've got different experiences. I kind of think I'm mostly successful, but it's quite hard for academic staff to put themselves in the shoes of a student now, when actually what you're doing is you're drawing on your own lived experience as a student, and that could be, you know, 30 plus years ago, like it is for me, and it was just such a different environment.
One thing I'm really, really curious about is Sheffield has a very high population of international students. I think it almost makes up a third of the university. Why? How does that change your approach to teaching? Because let's say on my course, for example, you know, I think I did electrical engineering for a year, and that was almost half like Chinese students on that course. So a lot of people's English wasn't great, and they might have, you know, that working in groups was quite difficult. Is that something you find in the biosciences, or is that not so much on that course?
We have a higher proportion of home students. We have some international students, and they're fantastic. Actually, you know, the thing I really love about Sheffield and our student cohort is their diversity, and it's not just like diversity around their, you know, what they like in terms of learning strategies and things like that. it's the different cultures that they come from, and it's fantastic hearing from my international students around what things are like back home and what they found different. As an academic tutor for international students, it helps me see where my students have come from, having those conversations, and they bring a richness actually to life at Sheffield. We've got all those fantastic societies that are based around different kind of cultural norms and kind of countries and things like that, and they do bring that richness to the university. But obviously some challenges as well. International students, English isn't their first language, and so there are some challenges there to make sure that my teaching is inclusive. I'm a firm believer in saying it as it is, so I'm not I have to use the technical language of the discipline, but I'm very much, I'll just be really kind of clear. I tend to use really kind of straightforward language in my teaching. That helps my students. The lecture capture, I mean, that is great for students where English isn't a first language, because they can go back in and they can re-listen to the bits that they didn't quite understand. But that's not to say there aren't some challenges. I have group work in one of my year 3 modules, but I have to say I haven't had any challenges in that space. By year 3, I think the students all know each other, whether they're home students, international students, and they've kind of got a really good dynamic. Next academic year, I'm co-running a brand new module for first years.
Okay.
And one of the assessments is a piece of group coursework around the Sustainable Development Goals. So I suspect that might be a little bit more challenging because they're first year students and they're starting in week 7. So they'll have a few weeks to kind of get to know each other, but they won't be as experienced in group work as my year 3 students. So my approach is going, we're putting them in their groups anyway. They're not picking. My year 3s get to pick their groups. My year 1s, we'll put them in groups, but we'll have to make sure we've got a good, really nice balance. They'll be within their tutorial groups. There'll be people they know. And it's around really just, providing an outlet. If a group's having a problem, then they can come and kind of let me know, and we'll have a group conversation, and, we'll take it from there. So I'm expecting not so much because there's international students in there, but because we've got students who are just newly a few weeks into their university studies, still finding their feet. And all of those students will be a little bit, I've got to work in a group with some people that I'm just getting to know. And, maybe there's someone in that group I don't get on with very well, but they're in my group and I'm going to have to work with them. So I think there are always challenges, but I think international students do bring a real richness and diversity to the university that I think benefits all of the students. I think it's great that we've got this fantastic group of students who come from all over the world. And actually, we've got diversity within our home students as well. Sheffield's got a great record of widening participation students, first generation students. And that's something I'm really passionate about because I was first generation. I was the first person to go to university in my whole family. On my mum's side, all of the family were kind of in the mining industry, and on my dad's side, they were all in construction. No one had kind of left the area at all. And, to go to university was a fantastic opportunity for me. And it's one that, I'll never forget because my parents, helped me get there. And it transformed my life. I'm a professor. I've got a fantastic job. I've had a chance to travel the world. I've been to Brazil. I've been to Hawaii, America, places in Europe. With conferences and things. So I think having those widening participation students, that opportunity, to come to a Russell Group University and study is fantastic for them. And it sends them off to places they would never have gone if they'd not gone to university. So we've got that diversity in all sorts of different spaces.
Absolutely. I think it's great as well from the student perspective because, I love group projects, especially in robotics engineering. We get such fun stuff to do. Like we'll get to make robots and play about and like design them and then build them and then test them. And usually they won't work, but eventually we'll get them working. And, but the group projects have been great. Like, I can think my last group project, it was me, a Nigerian, and 3 Chinese students. So it's quite diverse. But I really enjoy it. I love talking to people from different countries and different backgrounds because they live life so differently to how we do here. So it's just like fascinating talking to them. But I did ask one of the Chinese students. I said to him, I was like, what's it like being in Sheffield? Like, how different is it back home from China? And he said that it feels like he hasn't left China because there's so many Chinese students and all the Chinese restaurants in Sheffield that he feels like it's still here. So in that sense, it's quite nice as well, because I think there's still a community here for people coming because there are so many international students. And at least from my experience, I think international students, they're very open to making friends because they're away from home, so that they're very open to sort of talking to people and doing that. So it's very exciting. So we are coming towards the end. I just want to ask you a sort of final question. What are your plans for the next few years with teaching and with your digital tools? Like, is there anything you're especially excited about or working on that you want to talk about?
So I'm about 10 years away from retirement, and having, I've spent, up until this year, I'd spent pretty much 8 years in leadership roles. I first in what was the Department for Biomedical Science, and then roles in the faculty. So I'm quite enjoying this year, kind of stepping back from those kind of quite intense senior leadership roles. My main focus for the next few years is to deliver my teaching. Deliver the new curriculum. I have new modules I'm pulling together and designing. I think it's about continuing to provide an excellent learning experience for my students. I get really good module evaluation data, and that's important for me because I feel, it's my responsibility to make sure my students have that opportunity to learn. And if I get good module evaluation data, it shows me that they value what I'm doing. I think it's about making sure that my content is kind of continues to be up to date. So we have lectures on SARS coronavirus 2 and COVID-19 now in my modules, for example. And then I think the other side is really around my scholarship. So my educational research. I've got a number of papers I'm writing that I haven't had a chance to write because I've been in the senior leadership. Some new modules to deliver next year as well. And also about supporting others. I've got, a number of mentoring roles where I'm mentoring senior university teachers who are looking to get promoted to professor. And then I suppose at an institutional level, the thing I'm really interested in is open educational resources. So I chair the working group for the university, and we are just about to kind of kickstart some discussions around how we, at a strategic level, embed consideration for open educational resources into business as usual. So it becomes part of module design, part of program design. So an open educational resource, it is, as it says, it's basically free. It's a resource that anyone can access under a Creative Commons license, and you can adapt for your own teaching. And with the current financial challenges that the sector is facing and the cost of the textbooks and things like that, embedding open educational resources as the recommended reading can only be beneficial, both for students who can access it easily, and then also, for the university in terms of that kind of that cost benefit analysis. So I have got a senior leadership role that I'm in the moment, but it's very much around, it's basically like I had the role for let's get lecture capture implemented. It's now let's get open educational resources implemented. So for me it's really kind of keep going with some excellent teaching. There's no kind of digital tools I'm thinking about at the moment, but that's not to say they won't appear. And I'm always on the lookout. What's the next digital tool that's coming along? But there's nothing on the radar at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's exciting that you're going to teach a first year course, because I think for me at least, like coming to university, having those professors who I absolutely loved and they motivated me so much throughout the course because it's tough, but then when you have a great teacher, it's actually you just feel like excited to go to their lessons, and you feel like even though it's challenging, you just want to learn, and I think that's the great thing. I mean, the reason why I know you, Louise, is because I asked my friend Pierre Davies, who's on your third year course. I said to him, I was like, who is your best lecturer? Do you have any lecturers you recommend to come on the podcast? And he gave your name. So obviously you're doing a good job in that sense, and people like your teaching styles, and you're doing a good job. So I think it's great that you could teach some of those first years who are coming in, who are new, that haven't really got into that university world, and then get to experience a good lecture. That would be good. And so thank you very much for coming on the podcast. It's been great. I really appreciate speaking to you. It's been fun.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it. So, and good luck with the rest of your placement, and luck with the rest of your studies and that masters that you're talking about doing over in Denmark as well.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Take care now. Bye bye.